The rain had been falling over Montreal for 3 days straight, the kind of slow, relentless drizzle that soaks through your coat before you even notice it's happening. Tess Bourgeois had been awake since 4 in the morning. Not because of the rain. Not because of the double shift she'd pulled at St. Joseph's the night before. She'd been awake because she kept replaying the sound of the monitors flatlining in room 412, and she couldn't get her hands to stop shaking long enough to pour herself a decent cup of coffee. The café on Rue Sainte-Catherine was the only place open at that hour that wasn't a gas station. She knew it by smell before she'd even pushed the door open. Dark roast and something sweet, cardamom maybe, and the faint wood smell of a place that had been warm and crowded for decades. She went there when she couldn't sleep. She went there when she needed to remember that the world was still running, ordinary and indifferent, while everything in her felt like a power outage. She ordered her coffee at the counter without looking up. She carried it to the corner table near the window, the one tucked behind the bookshelf that the cafe owner had filled with battered paperbacks and old vinyl records. Nobody ever sat there at 5 in the morning. That was the whole point. Except someone already was. He wasn't what she noticed first. What she noticed first was the glass of water in front of him untouched, and the way his hand was pressed flat against the table. The particular stillness of a person trying not to move because moving hurt. His jacket was dark, the collar turned up. There was a cut along his jaw that someone had tried to close with butterfly tape and done a mediocre job of it. Tess stood there with her coffee for a moment longer than was probably polite. There were 4 other empty tables in the café. She pulled out the chair across from him. "Is anyone sitting here?" He looked up. His eyes were the kind of grey that shifts depending on the light, and right now the light was the colour of rain on glass. He looked at her the way people look at something unexpected. Not threatened, not welcoming, just recalibrating. "No," he said. She sat down. She didn't introduce herself. She opened her bag, pulled out the paperback she'd been carrying around for 2 weeks without getting past page 40, and set her coffee on the table. She wasn't trying to make conversation. She wasn't trying to do anything. She was tired and her hands were still unsteady, and this was the warmest corner in the building. After a while he said, "You're a nurse." She looked up. What gave it away? The badge. He nodded toward her collar, where she'd forgotten she was still wearing her lanyard from the hospital. "And the way you looked at my face when you sat down, like you were already counting stitches." 4, she said. Maybe 5 if whoever did that was being conservative. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, something adjacent to it. "It's fine. It's not fine, but all right." She went back to her book. His name, she would learn later, was not the name he gave her that morning. He told her his name was Reed. She believed it because she wasn't thinking about names. She was thinking about page 41 and whether the coffee was going to be enough to get her through the morning, and about the patient in room 412, whose family hadn't arrived in time. They sat in silence for 20 minutes. Comfortable silence, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. Most people, given a stranger across a table at 5 in the morning in an empty café, would fill the quiet with something. Weather observations. Apologies for taking up space. He didn't do any of that. He sat with his glass of water and his cut jaw and the particular quality of stillness she associated with people who had learned to be patient by necessity, not temperament. "Long night?" she finally asked. "Long week," he said. She nodded. "Me too." She left before 6. She had a shift starting at 7, and she needed to go home and change and pretend for at least 15 minutes that she was a person with a functional life. When she stood up, she glanced at his jacket again. The way it sat on his shoulders, the fact that he hadn't taken it off despite the warmth of the café. The kind of jacket you kept on, because you were either always ready to leave or always ready for something else entirely. "You should get those stitched properly," she said. "I'll keep that in mind." She walked out into the Montreal rain and didn't think about him again until the following Wednesday, when she pushed open the door of the same cafe at the same hour, and he was at the same table. The glass of water again, untouched. She sat down across from him without asking this time. The jaw healed, she said. You were right about the 5 stitches. I'm usually right about things like that. She flagged down the server. Did you eat anything? I was going to order something. She said it the way she said things at work, not unkind, not a request. He looked at her for a moment with that recalibrating expression again, then picked up the menu. His name was not Reed. She didn't know that yet. What she knew was that he ordered eggs and toast without looking at the menu, which meant he'd been here before. And that he ate slowly and methodically, and that twice during their conversation his eyes moved to the door with a precision that had nothing to do with curiosity. He was cataloguing. She recognized it because she did it too. In triage, in emergency rooms, in the particular chaos of a Saturday night at St. Joseph's. You learned to read a room not by looking directly at things, but by tracking everything in your peripheral vision simultaneously. She'd learned it in nursing school. She wondered where he'd learned it. What do you do? She asked. Consulting, he said. She let that sit there between them for a moment. The way you let a non-answer sit when you don't want to push, and you don't particularly need to know. What kind of consulting? The kind that keeps odd hours. She drank her coffee. Fair enough. He asked her about the hospital, not in the way people usually asked, the polite, slightly squeamish curiosity of someone who found hospitals interesting in the abstract, but didn't want too much detail. He asked specifically. Protocols. Triage systems. How decisions got made when there wasn't enough time to make them properly. She found herself talking for longer than she'd expected to, explaining things she'd never bothered to explain to anyone outside work, because there'd never been a point. He listened the way very few people actually listened, without waiting for his turn to speak. When she left that morning, she had his number in her phone under the name he'd given her, Reed. She'd entered it without thinking about why, only that it seemed like the practical thing to do when someone was clearly going to need stitches again at some point. She was not wrong about that either. The third time she saw him, it wasn't at the café. It was 11:30 on a Thursday night, and she was walking home from her shift along Rue Sherbrooke because the metro was delayed and the rain had finally stopped, and she wanted the air. She heard it before she saw it. Not the sound of the impact itself, but the aftermath. The particular silence that falls in the second after something violent happens, when everyone in the vicinity is still processing whether to run. 2 men on the pavement near the alley entrance. A third standing over them, and Reed, the man she knew as Reed, leaning against the brick wall with one hand pressed to his side, watching her approach with an expression she could only describe as resigned. Nurse Bourgeois, he said. What happened? She was already crossing the distance between them, already shifting into the mode she'd spent 7 years developing, the part of her that went calm exactly when everything around her stopped being calm. Minor complication. Stop talking. She knelt beside him, assessed the hand pressed against his ribs. Move your hand. It looks worse than move your hand. He moved it. It was not as bad as it could have been. A deep laceration along the lower ribs, clean edges, bleeding steadily but not arterially. She'd seen worse on a slow Tuesday. She'd also never seen anything like this on a person she'd had breakfast with, which created a strange doubling effect she pushed aside to deal with later. She worked with what she had. The small kit she carried in her bag out of habit, the habit of someone who'd grown up with a father who thought first aid kits were as essential as keys. She cleaned the wound and applied pressure and spoke in the low-level voice she used with patients who were frightened, even though he didn't look frightened. He looked, if anything, like he was trying not to be impressed. Who are those men? She asked. No one you need to worry about. Are they going to need medical attention? He considered this. Probably not, probably. Definitely not. A pause. Tess. It was the first time he'd used her name. She'd been wearing her badge again. You should come with me, he said. It's not safe to be standing here right now. I'm not the one bleeding. No, he said, but you're a witness to something, and I'd rather you weren't. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. The careful way he held himself, the way the 2 men on the ground weren't moving but were breathing. the way 3 black vehicles she hadn't noticed before were now idling at the end of the alley with their lights off. She was a nurse practitioner with 7 years of emergency experience and a healthy appreciation for situations that were above her pay grade. She went with him. The building he took her to was not what she expected, which meant she'd been building expectations, which meant she'd been thinking about him more than she'd admitted to herself. She'd expected something cold, industrial, the kind of space that announced its purpose through emptiness. What she got was a townhouse in Le Plateau with good furniture and too many books, and a kitchen that smelled like someone had been cooking recently. She sat at the kitchen table with her bag in her lap and watched a man she'd known for 3 weeks press a clean cloth to his own ribs and try to look casual about it. "Let me," she said. "You've done enough." "I haven't done nearly enough yet." She stood up and crossed the kitchen and took the cloth from him with the particular authority of someone who has decided a thing and is not interested in discussion. He let her. There was a first aid kit under the sink, a proper one, medical grade, the kind that suggested someone in this household got hurt on a regular basis and had made peace with that fact. She found suture thread and a curved needle. She found lidocaine. She found things that did not belong in a civilian first aid kit unless the civilian had very specific connections or very specific needs. "Who are you?" she asked. Not accusatory. She was threading the needle. "I told you. You told me your name was Reed and you did consulting." She looked up at him. "That was before I found medical-grade lidocaine under your kitchen sink." He was quiet for long enough that she began to work without an answer. She was good at this. Better than she should have been for a nurse rather than a surgeon, but she'd done a lot of suturing in a lot of circumstances, and her hands had stopped shaking somewhere between the alley and the front door. They always did, eventually. That was the thing about her hands. They went steady when she needed them to. "My name is Declan Rafferty," he said. She tied off a stitch. "Is that the real one?" "Yes, and the consulting." A long pause. "My family has certain business interests in Montreal," he said, "and in other cities. It requires management." "What kind of business interests?" He looked at her with those grey eyes that kept shifting, warmer now in the kitchen light. "The kind that results in situations like tonight." She tied off the last stitch. She cut the thread. She pressed clean gauze against the wound and taped it with more precision than strictly necessary because she was thinking, and that was what she did when she thought. She made things neat. "Declan Rafferty," she said. "The Rafferty Group." His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. She'd grown up in Montreal. She'd grown up in Verdun specifically, which meant she'd grown up knowing the names that certain people said quietly and other people didn't say at all. The Rafferty Group was a name you learned early if you paid attention. A name that showed up in newspapers occasionally, in business contexts, in the kind of coverage that was very careful about what it said and equally careful about what it didn't. She'd never connected it to a man with a cut jaw drinking water at 5 in the morning. "You knew," he said. "I suspected. Just now." She began putting things back in the kit. "It explains the odd hours, and yet you're still here. I'm still here because you're sutured, and I'd like to know that the sutures are going to hold before I go." She closed the kit and looked at him directly. "And because I've been coming to that café every Wednesday for 2 years, and nobody has ever sat at that corner table before you." He was quiet for a moment. "Why do you go at 5 in the morning?" "Same reason you do, probably. And what reason is that? Because some nights the world doesn't stop spinning fast enough to let you sleep." She stood and picked up her bag. "How long has the Rafferty Group been operating out of Montreal?" He blinked, very slightly, but she caught it. "That's not a question most people ask." "I'm not most people." She said it without ego, the way you stated a fact that had been confirmed over time. "I've been working emergency medicine since I was 22. I've talked to people in every kind of situation you can imagine. I know when someone is managing something large and when they're frightened, and you're managing something large and you're not particularly frightened, which means either you're very good at this or you've been doing it long enough that the fear wore off. Either way." She looked at his ribs. Don't sleep on your left side. She left. She got 2 blocks before her phone buzzed. The sutures held. The text read, "In case you were wondering." She stood on the pavement in the Montreal night, the wet street reflecting the amber streetlights, and allowed herself exactly 1 moment of acknowledging that she was in something she didn't fully understand yet. Then she kept walking. She saw him 4 more times over the following 2 weeks. Not at the café, at a restaurant he chose, which was the kind of restaurant that had no menu posted outside and required a reservation. She was fairly sure he'd arranged the same day. At a concert hall, briefly, because she'd mentioned she played violin, and he'd said the Orchestra Metropolitan was performing Sibelius on Thursday, and she'd asked how he knew her schedule, and he'd said he didn't. But he thought she might want to know. She played violin the way she sutured, with a precision that came from decades of practice, from a muscle memory so ingrained it had become something else entirely. She'd started at 6 years old in her grandmother's kitchen in Verdun, a grandmother who had opinions about Paganini and strong coffee and very little else. She'd played through school, through nursing college, through 7 years of night shifts and difficult losses, and the particular grind of a profession that takes everything you have and occasionally gives it back. She hadn't told anyone at St. Joseph's about the violin. It felt like the one thing that was entirely hers. She hadn't told Declan Rafferty either. She'd mentioned it once, obliquely, and apparently once was enough. "You're watching me," she said when she found him in the lobby after the performance. "I'm attending a concert. You knew I'd be here. I thought you might be." He handed her her coat, which she hadn't left with him and couldn't account for him having. "You played the Sibelius piece in your head the entire time the orchestra was playing it. I could see it in your hands." She looked down at her hands. They were moving slightly, the ghost of the fingering pattern. She made them stop. "What is it you actually want from me?" she asked. He looked at her. In the lobby light, the grey of his eyes was something close to blue. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's not something I say often." She believed him. She believed him because she'd spent 7 years reading people in crisis, and whatever else Declan Rafferty was, he was not a liar. He was someone who kept information close, which was different. She went home that night and sat at her kitchen table for a long time, her violin case beside her on the floor, and thought about what she knew and what she didn't. What she knew. His name was Declan Rafferty. His family ran something significant in Montreal that had required 3 black cars at the end of an alley and a medical-grade first aid kit under the kitchen sink. He'd been in that café on the 2 mornings when she most needed not to be alone. He listened the way people listened when they were actually interested. Not performing interest. What she didn't know, most of it. What she suspected, more than she was comfortable with. She opened her laptop. She typed his name into a search engine, which felt like a violation of something, and also like the most rational thing she'd done in 2 weeks. What came back was what she'd expected from a name like his: business articles, charitable donations, the polished surface of a family that had made sure its public face was clean and unremarkable. There was a photograph from a gala 3 years prior. He was in it, in the background, not looking at the camera. Not the way people accidentally avoided cameras. The way people who knew where cameras were positioned chose to stand slightly outside the frame. She closed the laptop. Her phone buzzed. "I should tell you something," the message read. She stared at it for a moment. Then she typed, "I know." A pause. "What do you know?" She thought about it. Then, "Enough. Tell me the rest in person. He came to the café," her table, early enough that the place was still half dark and the server was still setting out chairs. He looked different in the way people look different when they've made a decision. Something settled in the jaw, something deliberate in the way he carried himself. She had 2 coffees waiting. "My father is Cormac Rafferty," he said. "He built the organization. I've been running operations for 4 years since his health declined." She wrapped both hands around her cup. Operation. Distribution, primarily, and protection, and the management of certain territorial agreements with other families in the city. He looked at her steadily. "It's not a small thing what my family does, and it's not entirely clean. I know what the Rafferty Group is. Do you? I told you. I grew up in Verdun. She paused. One of the girls I went to school with had a brother who worked for your family for a few years, until he didn't. The silence stretched between them. Something moved through his expression that she thought might be the closest thing to apology she was going to get. What happened to him wasn't. I'm not asking you to explain it. She cut him off, not harshly. I'm telling you that I know what this is. I'm not a woman who doesn't know what this is. He leaned back slightly, reassessing. Why are you still here? He asked. It was the same question he'd asked in the kitchen after the stitches. She'd left without answering it then. She'd been thinking about the answer for 2 weeks. Because I've been a nurse for 7 years, she said. And I have spent 7 years watching what happens to people when they don't have anyone who will sit across a table from them and tell them the truth. And because you're the only person I've met in a long time who actually listens to what I'm saying, instead of waiting for me to finish. She looked down at her coffee. And because I am very good at things that have nothing to do with nursing, and I think you might need someone who is very good at those things. He was quiet. What things? She looked up. I read people, she said. I read rooms. I know when something is wrong before it happens. The way you know a code blue 30 seconds before the alarm sounds. Because you've been watching for it, without knowing you're watching for it. She set down her cup. I also know 6 of the 12 people at the Beaulieu Gala last month were carrying weapons they hadn't declared, and one of them was sitting at your table. And you looked at him twice in the first hour and didn't look at him again after that, which means you'd made a decision about him. Declan Rafferty looked at her for a long moment. How were you at the Beaulieu Gala? I played in the string quartet. She allowed herself the smallest smile. Hired musicians are invisible. The thing happened in his expression again, not a smile, the thing adjacent to it. Warmer this time. His name was Arsenault, he said. He was there on behalf of the Trepanier family. We had a disagreement about the port arrangement. It's been resolved. She nodded. The man he was with, the one by the east door, dark suit, earpiece. He's not Trepanier. I saw him 2 weeks ago outside St. Joseph's. Everything about Declan went still. Outside the hospital, she said. On the service road, not the main entrance. He was watching the shift change. I didn't know what it meant then. I do now. You're sure it was the same man? I have a very good memory for faces. She turned her cup in her hands. The kind of memory that comes from spending years assessing people in their worst moments and needing to remember every detail of what they looked like for the chart. She met his eyes. Someone is watching your operation through me. Through the hospital, maybe. I don't know why yet, but I think you should know. He looked at her for a long time. The café was waking up around them, the morning regulars beginning to filter in, the server making a round with the coffee pot, and Declan Rafferty, head of the Rafferty Group, one of the most carefully controlled men she had ever observed, sat across from her in the corner table near the bookshelf, and looked like someone who had just realized the geometry of everything had shifted. You've been thinking about this, he said. Since the alley. She pushed the second coffee toward him. Drink that. It's getting cold. What happened next did not happen quickly. That was the part that nobody would have believed, maybe, that it was slow and careful and methodical, like suturing, like tuning a violin. She didn't move into his world so much as she began to map it, the way you mapped an unfamiliar hospital on your first day. Exits and entrances, who talked to whom, where the pressure was and where it wasn't. She kept her shifts at St. Joseph's. She kept her Wednesday mornings at the café. She kept her violin, because the violin was hers, and she was not willing to let this change that. What she added was attention. More deliberate than what she'd been giving it already, which had been considerable. She started noticing which of the Rafferty contacts were fraying at the edges. The ones who came to meetings late, the ones whose eyes moved differently than they used to. She started noticing the pattern in the surveillance she'd spotted outside the hospital, the rotation schedule, the shift changes that mirrored the ones she knew from her own work. She told Declan what she found in the same way she'd present a patient case. Clear, sequential, without editorializing. He listened the way she'd learned he listened, with that quality of full attention that made everything feel more precise. "You should have been," he started once. "What?" He shook his head. "Something other than a nurse." "I'm not other than a nurse," she said. "That's the thing you keep almost understanding. Everything I'm telling you, I learned from nursing. You learn to read people when their lives depend on what you read. You learn to stay calm in chaos because the alternative is someone dying. You learn patterns because patterns are the difference between catching something and missing it." She looked at him. "The skill set isn't separate from who I am. It is who I am." He was quiet for a moment. "Your grandmother taught you violin. My grandmother taught me violin. And the reading people, my grandmother taught me that too." She almost smiled. She had opinions. The surveillance outside the hospital turned out to be connected to a man named Theodore Mosier, a name that meant something to Declan's inner circle and nothing to anyone outside it. He was trying to move against the Rafferty family through a complicated sequence of pressure points, and Tess had, without knowing it, become one of those pressure points. Not because of anything she'd done, because of who she'd been seen with. The question was what to do about it. She presented her analysis to Declan and two of his people, a woman named Bridget, who had the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had been managing complicated situations for decades, and a young man called Ferris, who looked like he should be in university, and had eyes that suggested he'd skipped that particular experience. They sat in the townhouse kitchen, the same table where she'd sutured Declan's ribs 3 months earlier, and she walked them through it the way she walked a new resident through a complex case. Here is what we know. Here is what we can infer. Here is where the evidence stops and the risk begins. The shift-change observation tells us they have an inside source at St. Joseph's, she said. Not someone senior. The timing is too specific to a nursing rotation, which means either someone on the floor or someone in scheduling. The surveillance pattern suggests they're not trying to move against me directly. I'm a monitoring point. They're watching to see when Declan makes contact. Bridget looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been surprised very few times in her life and found this one worth registering. "And your recommendation? Give them something to watch." She spread the photographs she'd taken, careful, clinical, shot on her phone during her regular commute without anyone noticing, because she'd learned the trick of photographing things without appearing to photograph things, in the same way she'd learned to take blood pressure readings without patients tensing up. If they're expecting contact, give them contact, but control what they see. "You're talking about using yourself as bait," Ferris said. "I'm talking about controlling the information." She looked at him steadily. "There's a difference. Bait is passive. This is active. The plan that emerged was not simple. Plans that actually worked rarely were. But it was precise, and precision was what she trusted. And she trusted it because she'd built it the same way she'd built everything she was good at. From the ground up, from first principles, from the accumulated knowledge of what she'd observed, and what she understood, and what she was willing to do. The night it resolved, she was not at the hospital. She was in a building overlooking the port, in a room with Bridget and a communications setup that reminded her of the monitoring stations at St. Joseph's. She had a radio in her ear and she was watching 4 screens, and she was as calm as she was in a code blue, which was to say completely. She spoke into the radio twice. The second time she said, quietly, the 3 words that triggered the end of the sequence, and then she took the earpiece out and set it on the table and looked out at the St. Lawrence River. In the dark, the lights of the South Shore reflected in the water, the slow movement of a freighter making its way east. Bridget said, "Where did you come from?" Tess considered the question. "Verdun," she said. "Rue de Verdun, specifically, my grandmother's house. She had a piano she never played and a violin she played constantly and opinions about everything. She trained you. She taught me that the most important thing you can do in any situation is stay in your own body. Know what you know. Don't panic about what you don't know yet." Tess watched the freighter. She was a very practical woman. Bridget was quiet for a moment. "Rafferty's going to want to talk to you." I know about more than tonight. I know that too. She pulled on her coat. She walked down from the building and onto the waterfront, the cold November air off the river, cutting through everything, the kind of cold that makes Montreal feel like itself, relentless and particular and not interested in your comfort level. Her phone buzzed. It held. The message read. She stopped walking. She looked out at the river for a moment, at the city's reflection in the dark water, at the lights of a place she'd grown up in and never left and was seeing differently now. Not with less love, just with more of the whole picture visible. She typed back, I know. I built it too. She started walking again. The rain had stopped. The streets were wet and amber-lit and very quiet, the particular quiet of a city that doesn't stop but occasionally breathes. She had a shift in 6 hours. She had a violin that needed tuning. She had a corner table in a café on Rue Sainte-Catherine that nobody else ever sat at. And she was beginning to understand, walked into something that was going to require every version of herself she'd ever been. The girl in her grandmother's kitchen learning to hear when a note was wrong. Before she could explain why, the student, with shaking hands learning to make them steady. The nurse who learned that knowing what was happening was only the beginning, that the real skill was knowing what to do about it. She had walked into something. She had not walked into it blind. That, she thought, was the difference.